Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, 9th annual meeting hosted by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization. Now, let us begin the side event, Roadmap Project 1, Low Carbon Ammonia. Before we start the session, there is an announcement for the participants. This session, Roadmap 1, was originally planned for 1 hour and a half. However, it will now be changed to 1 hour. First of all, I would like to introduce the moderator for the session. Mr. David Sandlow, a member of ICEF Steering Committee, Inaugural Fellow, Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University, Co-Director, Energy and Environment Concentration, School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University. And now, I'd like to ask Mr. Sandlow to moderate the session. Mr. Sandlow, if you please.
Thank you very much. It's so good to be here. It's great to be back in Tokyo. Thank you to Mehdi. Thank you to Nito for organizing this tremendous event, and congratulations to everybody who had a hand in organizing it. At this conference, we are releasing our 10th ICEF roadmap, and I'm very excited to tell you about the roadmap that we are releasing a draft of today. So why don't we go to the slides, if you could pull them up. And go to the next slide. And this just takes you through a bit of the history of the ICEF roadmaps that we've done in the past 7 years here. If you're interested in any of these topics, I recommend seeking out these roadmaps. And we have a booklet that's being distributed and is going to be online, which summarizes each of these roadmaps. As you can see, in the past 7 years, ICEF has supported roadmaps on a wide range of decarbonization topics. Some of them are pretty well known, and some of them are less well known. I noticed, for example, that in 2018, we did a roadmap on direct air capture, and then I was really delighted that this morning there was a full special session on direct air capture sponsored by Nito in this room, actually, just a few hours ago. And the topics that we're covering are really important for achieving net zero emissions and are critical for the path for decarbonization more broadly. And so this roadmap is on low carbon ammonia. And we have actually a team of 7 co-authors. Maybe go back to the first slide for a minute, if you would, Anne-Catherine. And 4 of them are with us today. And let me just introduce them. With me here on stage is Anne-Catherine Mers, who's an industry analyst at Ammonia, which is a low carbon ammonia company based in New York City and growing rapidly. And she's also a researcher at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia's University, which is where I work. Online, we have Corinne Scone, who's Deputy Division Director at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. She's an expert in life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis of low carbon fuels and products, and has been a key player in developing this roadmap, along with Fan Jiwan, who is a PhD candidate and research associate at Columbia University also. And his research focuses on carbon management policy and energy systems modeling. And Fan has played a key role as well. We have 3 other co-authors who are not able to be with us today. It's been a great team working on this roadmap. And like all of the other ICEF roadmaps that we've done in the past 5 or 6 years, this one is going to be put online for public comment for the next several weeks. So if you or your colleagues have any comments, any suggestions about the text, please send them to us. There's an email address that's in the document, but it's ICEF2022@gmail.com, ICEFroadmap22@gmail.com. We're collecting comments, and then we're going to release the final version of this roadmap at the Climate Conference of the Parties in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, in about 6 weeks. So with that, why don't we go to the next slide? Or a slide, and I will turn it over to Ms. Mers.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today with you to talk to you about our low-carbon ammonia roadmap. To start off, we're going to start really basic with the question, what is ammonia? Ammonia is one of the foundational industrial chemicals. One of its most important roles is as a feedstock in nitrogen fertilizer. Without nitrogen fertilizer, about half of the world's population could not be supported. So this is really important. And ammonia is incredibly versatile. It's also used as a feedstock in a variety of chemicals, rubber, plastics, and even explosives. And on the slide, you'll see pictured an ammonia molecule, which consists of nitrogen and 3 hydrogen molecules. And it is these 3 hydrogen molecules that make ammonia very hydrogen rich, and is one of the reasons it's also being discussed as a hydrogen carrier, which simply means that ammonia could be a very useful way for us to more easily and more cost-effectively transport hydrogen as we look to this future growing hydrogen industry. And finally, and most importantly for us, you'll see that ammonia does not have a carbon molecule. And so that means that when ammonia is combusted, meaning when it is burned, we do not release any carbon dioxide. So ammonia being carbon-free makes it really important for us as we look to a carbon-free future. In terms of ammonia's basic properties, so ammonia is a chemical. It's a colorless gas that smells terrible. And the fact that it smells terrible is a huge benefit for us because it means if there is a leak, we will smell it. We will know very quickly before it can hurt us. Another important property of ammonia is the fact that when we compare it to, say, a competitor like natural gas, ammonia has a lower energy density. This means the same tank full of natural gas and the same tank full of ammonia, the tank full of ammonia is going to have less energy. So as we look to using ammonia as a fuel, that means that the same ship running on an ammonia tank will not go as far as a ship running on a natural gas tank. That said, ammonia is also less flammable than gasoline or natural gas, which is great from a safety perspective, but is a challenge when one of our goals for ammonia is to use it as a fuel and to combust it. In the end, the key with ammonia is the fact that it is a basic chemical that we've been using for a long time in industry. It's something that is already extensively regulated, that industry already has experience with, and so we already have the foundational regulations we need as a platform to keep building further. Now, ammonia has huge potential for our carbon-free future, but in the current status quo, ammonia production is a dirty fossil fuel-based business. Ammonia is responsible for nearly 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is because 72% of ammonia is produced from natural gas, while the other 26% is produced from coal. So being a fossil fuel-based process, ammonia production today results in a lot of emissions. Pictured on the slide, you see a picture of an ammonia plant. And you'll notice that these plants are enormous, and they have only grown over time. A plant that is built today can easily produce upwards of 3,500 tons of ammonia per year. And in turn, being so large, they are also very expensive, having a typical capital investment of over $1.6 billion, and on top of this, a very long capital lifetime. So after a plant is built, it can be used for around 50 years, which is very important for us to think about as we look to building a low-carbon ecosystem. Because while in Europe, a plant age is about 40 years old, meaning we're just 10 years away from sweeping changes in terms of new plants being built, when we look to China, the average plant age is only 12 years, 12 out of 50. So this means that in China, long past when we want to be carbon neutral, we're still going to have these very dirty plants. And a final important point as we think about ammonia is in the ammonia production process, you first produce hydrogen, and then this hydrogen is turned into ammonia. And when we look at the emissions throughout the process, it is this part where the hydrogen is produced that is responsible for 90% of emissions. So as we want to decarbonize ammonia, we have to think first and foremost about decarbonizing hydrogen. So what are our options? So when we want to decarbonize ammonia, first remember this existing system of natural gas and coal ammonia plants. The first option is to retrofit them with carbon capture and storage, and storing it underground or in long-lived products. So this is often called blue ammonia. This is important because it's the system we have, and given that there's likely going to be high demand in the future for ammonia, these plants that already exist are going to keep producing. Then the second option as we build new plants is green ammonia. And so green ammonia refers to hydrogen that is produced by running an electric current through water. And when this electricity that is running through water is carbon-free, so that means when we are using solar or wind energy or nuclear energy, then we have the possibility of creating ammonia without any emissions at all. And then a final option for producing ammonia that's often forgotten is that we can also use biomass, particularly using waste biomass as a feedstock. Could be extremely beneficial as a way to take something that would, as waste, decompose and release methane, so release greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, and instead turn it into something useful that really helps us. Now, we have these categories for ammonia production. We have blue ammonia, we have green ammonia, we have ammonia from biomass, often called biohydrogen. But these are really broad terms, and within that, how much the emissions are actually reduced can vary significantly. So to explain how much variation there is, let me share this graph with you. So this graph shows the life cycle emissions of various hydrogen production methods. We're using hydrogen as a proxy for ammonia because there is better data on hydrogen, and as mentioned, hydrogen is responsible for most of the emissions in producing ammonia. What this graph shows on the y-axis is the kilogram of carbon dioxide emitted per kilogram of hydrogen, and on the x-axis, we have the various production methods. So for your reference, the tallest bar on the far left, the black bar, is hydrogen produced from coal, which is by far the dirtiest. The next two green bars might surprise you a little. These bars could be called green ammonia because it refers to ammonia produced using electricity, but instead of clean renewable electricity, this refers to ammonia produced from the current grid, which is fossil fuel based and very dirty. The key message here is that to get to really carbon-free ammonia, it depends on the electricity source used, where the cleaner the energy source, the cleaner the ammonia molecule. So to get to that tiny dot further along on the right, that zero emissions dot, which is where we want to be, we really have to use carbon-free electricity. And fortunately, industry understands this, and this is definitely where things are headed. But from a policy perspective, it's important to keep in mind how important the electricity source is. The next bars in the middle, the gray bars, refer to natural gas-based ammonia production, which turns blue when we add the carbon capture retrofit. And this just shows how with carbon capture, we can get to really low emissions. And then finally, on the far right, we have negative emissions for ammonia that is produced from biomass. Now, whether or not biomass is good or bad all depends on implementation. But in the best case scenario, where we would be using biomass that absorbs carbon dioxide as it grows, and then use carbon capture to capture any emissions that are emitted as this biohydrogen is produced, in that scenario, we can get to carbon-negative ammonia. So by producing ammonia with biomass, we can get to negative emissions and take in more carbon dioxide than we're putting out. Now, to be clear, this is not possible to meet all of our global ammonia demand. Biomass is only suitable in certain situations, but given the benefits, when we have the option, this is something we should really think about. As with most amazing innovative technologies, unfortunately, the main barrier right now is cost. So here we have a graph where the bars show the costs of the different production methods. The smallest bar in the middle, the gray bar, is our natural gas-based ammonia, which is why natural gas, being by far the cheapest option, is the one that dominates industry today. The green bars further on the right, those are the green ammonia bars, which are the cleanest and really where we want to go, but still the most expensive. While this is what the cost profiles look like today, the good news is that the green technologies are going to become substantially cheaper in the future. So in the same way we had these dramatic cost declines in the solar industry, we expect the same dramatic cost declines to happen for green ammonia production technology for the electrolyzers. The second key takeaway here is that the current cheapest option, or what was for a long time the cheapest option, was using natural gas. But as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, natural gas prices have fluctuated dramatically. And where in the last 20 years, natural gas prices were between $100 to $600 per ton. In 2021, we crossed $1,000 per ton. And then in the United States, we even crossed $1,500 per ton. The point is that with this dramatic fluctuation, we can't assume that natural gas-based ammonia is always going to be the cheapest option. Now, passing it over to David, who's going to talk about how we can use ammonia in various applications.
Thanks, Anne-Catherine. So next question that we looked at in our roadmap is, what can you do with this low-carbon ammonia? How can it help you? If you can successfully produce low-carbon ammonia using the methods Anne-Catherine was just talking about, what good does it do you? And if you could pull the slide back up. The first most compelling use for this ammonia is to substitute it for the ammonia that's being used today in agriculture. Almost all the ammonia used today, or more than half of the ammonia that's produced today in this big global industry, is used in agriculture. And the ammonia that can be made with low carbon production methods can just be substituted as a drop-in replacement for that ammonia. And that would help to reduce the almost 2% of global emissions that come from the production of ammonia. And at this point, it's maybe useful to just stop and clarify something. The term low carbon ammonia can be a little bit confusing because low carbon ammonia, its properties are no different than regular ammonia. Neither one of the ammonia molecules has carbon in it. When we say low carbon ammonia, just to be clear, what we mean is ammonia that's made with low carbon production methods. Okay? So I'm just going to repeat that. If the chemists in the room probably know this already, but if you're not a chemist, it might not be that obvious. But low carbon ammonia is exactly the same molecule as regular ammonia. The difference is how it's made and whether it's made with a low carbon production process. So having made it with a low carbon production process, you can just immediately drop it in to agriculture or other places where ammonia is currently being used. And that's the first most obvious thing to do with low carbon ammonia. But there's more that we can do with it, fortunately. Low carbon ammonia actually has tremendous potential to help decarbonize other sectors. And that's the next slide. And so today, we are using carbon-based fuels to operate many, many different sectors: shipping, heavy industry, the power sector, and elsewhere. And ammonia, as Anne-Catherine was saying, is combustible, it'll burn, and it can be a replacement for carbon-based fuels in a number of these sectors. Now, that's already happening here in Japan, actually. Ammonia is being used to co-fire coal plants, and that's reducing carbon emissions in the process because that ammonia, when burned, doesn't create CO2. The coal, when burned, does. There's tremendous potential here, but because ammonia is not as combustible, because it has different properties when put into boilers and furnaces, work is needed to make sure that this can happen and happen efficiently. We thought, from the research that we did in preparing this roadmap, that one of the highest potential areas is the shipping sector. And global shipping is deeply challenged in terms of decarbonization because it runs on carbon-based fuels. But there's a lot of attention to using ammonia as a substitute. And you can run ships on ammonia. And if you run ships on ammonia, you're not going to be generating the greenhouse gases. But actually, Anne-Catherine, I know you've worked some on this. You want to just add a word, because you've got some expertise here about ammonia in the shipping sector?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So ammonia in the shipping industry is a really interesting case because there's no easy solutions to decarbonize shipping. And again, we have the same risks, whereas ships are these massive capital assets, 30-year lifetimes, that makes the industry very reluctant to change and adopt new technologies. But ammonia, being this very energy-dense fuel, is one of the best options we have, which is why these ongoing developments, the developments where Japan is actually one of the leaders, to develop ammonia engines, and then further along in the future, to go to fuel cell engines, which would be the cleanest and most efficient, are very important.
Great, thank you. Next slide. Did you want to talk about this?
Yep. Yes, and so while there's a lot of need for development in the shipping industry, other applications for ammonia also need further research and development. So we talked about the importance of developing ammonia's combustion characteristics, because it's ultimately by combusting ammonia and using ammonia for industrial processes as high quality heat that we have one of the greatest potentials for reducing emissions. We also here in Japan, this is another important application, as mentioned, is using ammonia for power generation. And so this is where the ongoing research in co-firing, so in using ammonia to replace coal, is also so important as well. So we see that there's a lot of movement in research and development, and especially in demonstrations to prove these technologies, but we also still have a long way to go to make these applications ready for ammonia.
Great. So we're going to talk about a few more topics that we discussed in our roadmap, and then we're going to throw it open for questions. And so if you have questions, I think they can be sent in via the web. Please send us any question that you've got. And so we're just in the remaining time we have, we're going to talk about infrastructure needs. We're going to talk about research and development policy, and then our findings and recommendations. So we'll go through these relatively quickly. But one of the key points that emerge in our research is that there is enormous infrastructure investment that's needed in order to scale up an industry of low carbon ammonia. We need to develop ways of producing ammonia without carbon emissions. We need new applications. But this is going to involve enormous amounts of capital and enormous amounts of infrastructure. The basic infrastructure that's involved is first pipelines. And pipelines are the cheapest way to move low carbon ammonia. There are pipelines that go for thousands of kilometers carrying ammonia, particularly actually in our country, in the United States, and in some other places. But if we're really going to scale this up, we're going to need a lot of investment in pipelines in lots of places. We're also going to need investment in port infrastructure, including storage and bunkering for fuels. One of the really interesting potentials here is modifying liquid natural gas storage and transportation facilities. And for example, the regasification facilities that are here in Japan for receiving LNG can be converted to receive low carbon ammonia. And that can be part of a transition plan over the course of the next several decades. The literature on this is not that deep, but what we identified, some estimates were that in the range of 10 to 20% of the capital cost of an LNG regasification terminal needs to be invested in order to make it capable of receiving ammonia. And that's not nothing, but it's also within the realm of what's possible if there's a commitment to this type of transition. Public-private partnerships are likely to play a really important role here. We think private capital is going to be important in this area, but it's going to need the role of public entities, maybe for guaranteeing some of the financing, maybe for permitting and related issues. So the next slide, please. So let's talk about another topic, and we can come back to this in the question. We will come back to this in the question and answer period. But this is a really key point. That there are health, safety, and environmental issues associated with ammonia. They're real, but they can absolutely be managed. And here's the key point. We have an enormous global industry for ammonia today with tremendous experience. 180 million tons of ammonia are produced and used around the world today. So the understanding of the health and safety issues associated with ammonia is very mature. And moving to low carbon ammonia manufacturing does not alter the risks. Next slide. And here are just some key points on this slide. So first, ammonia is actually less flammable than methane which reduces some direct safety concerns. And Anne Catherine has already made this point. Ammonia has a strong odor. So if there's a small leak, you can tell whether it's happening. Experts talk about this as being self-alarming. And we know good management practices. The big issues here are really in the bottom two bullets on this slide, and we really want to emphasize one of them, which is the top priority is avoiding large uncontrolled releases. There are occasionally large uncontrolled releases of ammonia from industrial facilities, and those are fatal. Those have resulted in people dying. And ensuring that the best practices are used to avoid large uncontrolled releases is really important. It's something we know how to do, but as the industry scales up, it's absolutely essential that the best management practices are used. And then there are potential impacts on local air quality, particulate formation, and on water quality. Those are pretty well understood. They need to be monitored carefully. So these risks are real, but we think they can be managed with the right attention. Next slide. We have a chapter on research and development priorities. We can come back to this in the Q&A a little bit more, but I'll just kind of run through these slides. We identified the following research and development priorities. First, deep integration with renewable energy, especially where resources are far from the energy consumed. For green ammonia, increasing life cycle energy efficiency and reducing capital intensity is key. There are some electrochemical reduction methods for producing ammonia that definitely require advanced R&D that we think would benefit from serious R&D investment from governments and companies. For blue ammonia, a lot of the R&D really is the same type of R&D that you would have for any type of carbon capture, but increasing net carbon capture and net CO2 capture from these processes. Novel uses is a really important area. We've already talked about it a little bit, but making sure that turbines and the combustion of ammonia can happen efficiently, better understanding of management and safety risks, and then better understanding of life cycle energy and climate issues. So those are the research and development priorities that we identify in our roadmap. And actually, we're hoping for comments from all of you about what you think the priorities are. Next slide, please. So the policy landscape here is really moving quickly. And we especially wanted to note the Japanese government has been a leader in procuring low carbon ammonia for power plants and for shipbuilding, and has helped to lead the world on this. In the United States, just in the past several months, we now have extremely generous tax incentives for the production of low carbon hydrogen, which is the biggest single cost of the production of ammonia. And I think that's going to drive the global market, actually. There's going to be a lot happening in the United States as a result of the tax incentives for low carbon hydrogen production. European Union has a lot of work on green hydrogen. There was just a controversial decision to remove so-called additionality requirements. It's a little bit technical, but it's something that called for by the hydrogen industry over there. But essentially, it makes incentives for low carbon hydrogen more generous and more available in more circumstances in the European Union. And then lots of nations are investing in R&D and demonstration projects. Next slide, please. And here's a really key point, that policy support is going to be essential, that this industry is not going to move without policy support. And we have a chapter on this. Welcome any thoughts and comments. And just among the key points that we make, first, demand-side policies, supply-side policies, enabling policies, regulatory streamlining, all that's going to be required. Streamlining of permitting it's an important issue here, as in a lot of the clean energy transition. Low carbon ammonia could be highlighted more centrally in national hydrogen strategies. The national hydrogen strategies are widespread. Many, many countries have national hydrogen strategies. Not that many focus on low carbon ammonia, and we think that could make a big difference. And here's the bottom point on this slide is a really important one that maybe requires more discussion. But low carbon ammonia, I think it's missing a word there. There should be ammonia after that. Low carbon ammonia will not be the optimal solution everywhere. We need to assess where it will be the best solution. There's been a lot of dialogue I've seen in the past month or two around using hydrogen and ammonia in heating of homes, for example. And there's a lot of people who say it's not an efficient way to heat homes. that electricity and heat pumps are a better way to heat homes. And we think there's tremendous potential in low carbon ammonia, but we're not saying that it should be used everywhere. It should be used some places, and over time it will have to compete against other decarbonization strategies. We think it has particular potential, as I said earlier, in agriculture, in shipping, in some parts of the power sector. Next slide. Now I'll turn it to you for the findings. And
yes, so now moving on to findings and recommendations. So first for our findings, our first finding is ammonia's tremendous mitigation potential, so that with low carbon ammonia, we can significantly reduce our greenhouse gases this decade and in coming decades. So some sectors, like fertilizer, are ready to be decarbonized with green or low carbon ammonia today, whereas other sectors, like shipping and the power sector especially, are going to be very important in the future and have tremendous potential moving forward. Our second finding is that there are no technical barriers to producing low carbon ammonia in large quantities. So we understand the technology for producing low carbon ammonia. The obstacles are human, they are political and societal, but the technology itself is something we understand. So in the case of blue ammonia using carbon capture, the big obstacles are going to be transporting carbon and then finding places to store this captured carbon. In the case of green ammonia, we face more political obstacles, such as siting. So siting places to build the renewable energy for green ammonia, siting for the transmission lines to transport this electricity, and to build the green ammonia plants themselves. Not to mention other constraints as the system develops, such as the high expected demand for the technology to produce green hydrogen, but the limited capacity to manufacture this technology, the electrolyzers. But in the end, we understand the technology, and these other barriers are barriers that we can address. Our third finding is that cost is the chief barrier to deployment. The technology is there, but it is expensive, and if we really want to enable this widespread use, this large impact in shipping and in the power sector, then we need to bring the costs for producing ammonia down. Our fourth finding is that the environmental risks, they are there, but we understand them, and that with careful attention, they are manageable. The biggest environmental risk is really an accident that would be a large uncontrolled release. But again, with appropriate policies, we can ensure that this doesn't happen. And as for small releases, as previously discussed, it smells terrible. We'll know if there's an ammonia leak. Our fifth finding is that we need to build this large ecosystem for low carbon ammonia, that we need to build this infrastructure. So we understand the production and we understand the uses, but there's a lot that goes around that. So if we think about the shipping industry, for example, we don't just need the ships. We also need the port infrastructure with the appropriate bunkering facilities and the storage facilities to enable the low carbon ammonia. Our sixth finding is that for low carbon ammonia to deliver abatement in other sectors like the power sector, we need additional research. There's a lot that we don't understand. We're still very, very close, but we need to take that next step to fund the demonstration projects that really make this commercially viable for companies. And again, from an American perspective, it's been encouraging to see what has been happening in Japan and taking that next step in research. And then our seventh finding is that very few countries have policies in support of low carbon ammonia. So as David mentioned, we have 35 countries that have hydrogen strategies, but very few countries take that next step to consider in which cases would ammonia actually be better. Because again, hydrogen is great for some situations, but when we think, for instance, about issues of transport and storage, we have much more experience in handling ammonia, and there's going to be certain situations where ammonia is the better option. Now moving on to recommendations.
Great, and we're almost done here. We have a number of recommendations in the report. We pulled out a few of them to share with you today. And the first is that government should provide incentives for low carbon ammonia supply. As we said earlier, this doesn't happen without policy support from governments. Second is that government should launch the public-private partnerships to plan, develop, and finance infrastructure. That's going to be pipelines and ports in particular, port infrastructure. And third, that governments and industries should invest in innovations for the use of low carbon ammonia. Next slide. A key point is that international certification systems and standards should be developed, in particular for fuel ammonia. Without those types of international certification systems and standards, ships aren't going to be able to use this, and other uses are going to be constrained. And so certification bodies need to get to work on this. Data gathering is really important, as is human capital development, and we recommend work on that. And then the last recommendation we're highlighting here, next slide. This is so important we decided to put it in italics, so I'll just talk about it for a minute. That the policy incentives to bring low carbon ammonia to market should be based on the life cycle carbon intensity, not on the color or method of production. And this is something we've seen in some places. In particular, we see that policy advocates are calling for example, incentives for green ammonia, but not blue ammonia. Our view is we should look at what the life cycle carbon intensity is. If blue ammonia can produce ammonia with fewer emissions of carbon dioxide, it should be eligible for the same type of incentive. And this is an old issue in regulation that we're looking at results, not at mandating particular technology approaches. And we think it applies here. So policy incentives should focus on what are the life cycle incentives. Next slide. This is what we call our roadmap figure. It's something we do every year as part of the roadmap project. We look at what should happen in the near term, the medium term, and the long term. We're still working on this slide, as you can tell. The long term got cut off here, we're sorry, but a better version of this is going to be in the roadmap that we pull up. And we look across a number of different areas, production, application, health and safety policy, and say what should be done in the near term, 1 to 3 years, what should be in the medium term, and then what should be done in the long term. And this is our roadmap for how to make sure that low carbon ammonia can contribute to a low carbon future. And next slide. Thank you for listening. So this roadmap is going to be posted on the ICEF website this afternoon. It is open for comment. The address, please send any comments to ICEF roadmap2022@gmail.com. That's going to be in the roadmap. I want to thank again NITO. For their support for this work. Thank Mehdi. Thank my amazing co-authors. Thanks to Ann Catherine, who is wise beyond her years. I don't want to embarrass you by saying, she's how young, but she's doing just an amazing job on this, and our other great co-authors, 2 of whom are with us today. And thanks to our leader, Chair Nobuo Tanaka, who's here as well. So thank you, everybody. Let me bring in Dr. Scone, who is I think she's in Berkeley, California right now. You can correct me if I didn't quite get that right, Corinne. And ask you about the environmental risks of ammonia, because you have a lot of expertise in that, and you wrote our chapter in the roadmap on that. Can you just talk about the health and environmental risks from ammonia that we should be most cognizant of from your view?
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I'm in Emeryville, but close enough. So, you guys covered the really important points. The self-alarming characteristic is helpful because it means you're unlikely to have the same kind of situation that you can have with natural gas, where you've got a slow leak that gets beyond the lower flammability limit, which is quite low for methane. It's 4.4%, at which point it can ignite. Ammonia, in addition to smelling bad, has a lower flammability limit of 15%. So at that level, you're much more worried about the acute toxicity effects on any people who are around you than you would be about the flammability. And so when we think about uncontrolled releases, we're really paying attention to the toxicity. That's going to be the immediate concern. And as you guys mentioned, we know how to handle ammonia. If anything, as a refrigerant, it undergoes these kind of big temperature and pressure swings that can elevate some of the risks associated with a potential uncontrolled release. And so, from kind of an occupational and safety standpoint, that's what we worry about. And then from a broader environmental standpoint, we worry about ammonia getting out into the environment as like a nutrient. So it can deposit in water bodies. And if that water body is nitrogen limited, then you're basically adding nutrients that can cause things like harmful algal blooms. The other thing it can do is react with other pollutants that come from combustion, so nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides. Those form acids in the atmosphere, and then the ammonia can react with those and form particulate matter. And this fine particulate matter is really harmful to humans when we breathe it in. This is a primary driver of like air pollution related human health impacts. And so that's something we have to keep in mind. And you know, for better or worse, the effects can be quite heterogeneous depending on where you are and the background concentrations of all these other pollutants. So when we think about like where you have the greatest impact, it would probably be in a place where there are not a lot of other sources of ammonia being emitted. So you're quote unquote ammonia limited. Yeah, so I'd say those are kind of the primary issues. But one of the things I just wanted to mention for context is that a lot of ammonia gets emitted, the majority of it from the like agriculture and livestock, so crops and livestock. And most of that is not like leakage from ammonia production. It's ammonia volatilizing on the field. It's coming from manure. Also, a fair bit gets emitted when we burn biomass, like for home heating or something, for residential biomass combustion. And so when we looked at, you know, a reasonable leakage rate, we took the leakage rate from natural gas as a proxy, so 2.3%, and applied that to ammonia and looked at that from the perspective of like the IEA scenarios for how much ammonia we would produce for novel uses. That resulted in an approximately 5% increase in global ammonia emissions above what we already emit from primarily the agricultural sector. So, you know, we have to kind of put these releases in context. Like, depending on how much ammonia ends up getting used for novel uses, the change in emissions may be fairly marginal. But again, we do have to pay attention to where it's getting released.
Thank you, Corinne. And I'm going to come back to you in a minute because we have an interesting question from the audience about how large-scale deployment of ammonia affects the global nitrogen cycle, or would affect it, and other planetary boundaries. But before I come back to you on that, in your thoughts, let me turn to Fan Jiwan, who is, I believe he is in New York City. Again, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Fan, thank you for your great work on this roadmap. And Fan did our chapter on applications and uses of low-carbon ammonia. And I wondered if you, Fan, could you just talk about what policies you think are important to help bring out some of these novel uses and new uses of low-carbon ammonia?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question, David, and greetings everyone from New York City. Regarding the application and use of ammonia, the biggest challenge is still the cost of ammonia itself, that relative to other options or the original fossil fuel production pathways, using low carbon ammonia can be more expensive. And that is what the producers and investments are most sensitive about, that the cost increase will drive down the profit or even losing the money. So closing the pricing gap of low carbon ammonia with other competitive alternatives or its original fuel will be the key question. There are multiple policies that can actually perform those policies and do this. Some can add subsidies to the low carbon ammonia production, so the low carbon ammonia cost will be lower. Some can add in taxes or driving down the cost higher for the dirty sources, or can design a carbon market entering mechanism to prevent those high carbon approach from the market. But the most important standard here is it has to be carbon-based standards. We have to always remember the original point that we want to start using low carbon ammonia to replace the old production pathways is that we want to reduce the CO2 emissions. So all kinds of supporting policies regarding from this point has to be carbon-based. That's directly related to the last recommendation we just mentioned, that color doesn't matter for this context. All the ammonia atoms, all the ammonia molecules are the same. They can be directly replaced by each other but what makes them different is the production pathway, whether it's low carbon or not. So as long as low carbon ammonia production is low carbon, we should be giving enough incentives for them, whether it's blue or green, or for bio ammonia or biohydrogen, it could be carbon negative, that is removing carbon from the atmosphere during its production. Those carbon incentives should be correctly incentivized in order to drive the production and the application of ammonia itself.
Great, thank you. Let's come back to this really interesting question from the audience. And Corinne, I'm going to turn to you on this first, but then anybody who has any thoughts. The question is, how does large-scale deployment of fuel ammonia affect the global nitrogen cycle and planetary boundaries more broadly? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I'll admit I'm not an expert in the kind of planetary boundaries analysis. This is just not something that I think many of us have done in the life cycle assessment community. You know, what I can say is that there's still a fair bit to be learned about how an increase in ammonia releases would impact the nitrogen cycle. You know, there's certainly a concern that you could end up with more N2O and so have the kind of indirect effect on greenhouse gas emissions and warming. But again, you know, we would expect the leakage rate to be modest. I would say using a methane leakage rate as a proxy is probably a worst case scenario. And so if you believe the IEA scenario of 125 million tons of ammonia per year for novel uses, and I think that was for power and marine fuels, then it should result in a fairly marginal change in emissions relative to how much we emit now. Like, you know, if that's your big concern, then the goal really should be to reduce emissions from the agricultural sector, because that's responsible for the vast majority of these emissions. And there are ways that we could do that, right? You know, improved manure management, you know, not over applying fertilizer, that kind of thing. But I agree, you know, it's something to keep in mind. And I've also seen really varying estimates for how much ammonia would be, you know, we might produce it for these novel uses. And so, of course, if you're going to produce like 10 times that amount that we use from the IEA, then it really potentially becomes a problem. So, yeah, we have to keep in mind that the leakage rate and also that sort of total value that we're expecting to see as we scale this up.
Yeah, great, thank you. And that brought out a point we haven't discussed yet, which is how much would the industry scale up under these scenarios? And there are different analyses that are out there, but right now it's around 180 million tons that are being used. And I think most analyses tend to be in the area of a couple of times that, right? That we're talking about hundreds of millions of more tons of low carbon ammonia or more ammonia could be produced using these methods. That's the rough scale.
And if I can just jump in here, because ammonia is so versatile and can be used in so many different ways, it seems like we're looking at a future where there's many possible sources of demand, many ways we could use ammonia, but the limiting factor will likely be the low carbon supply. And so that is, given that we're likely to be more supply limited, we want to look to what the highest potential, the highest impact uses are first and try to use those. And then from there, we'll hopefully be building out our supply production to then move into other applications.
We have a question about methanol and the comparison with methanol. Let me read it and then see whether anyone would like to take this. Why use ammonia instead of methanol, which has an equally well-developed global infrastructure network? It's a dense hydrogen carrier and is already used as a transport fuel in some countries like China. Why not just go directly to methanol? Any thoughts on that?
So what I would jump in and say here first is that as we look at the shipping industry in the future, we're probably looking at a multi-fuel future. So right now there's a lot of pressure in the industry to pick a winner. You know, is the winner going to be methanol or is the winner going to be ammonia? But what is more likely to happen is the classical all-of-the-above situation that we have for decarbonization, where we're probably not going to get enough ammonia for all of the shipping industry, and we're not going to get enough methanol for all of the shipping industry. So we're looking at a future where we're going to be using both fuels. The next point I would say is that only ammonia can truly be carbon neutral. So methanol is a little bit more complicated, and I'm not going to avoid the tangent a little bit too much here. But for methanol to be carbon neutral, it depends on where the carbon molecule in methanol is coming from.
Yeah.
But when methanol is used, it does still emit CO2. It's only if you get that carbon-free molecule within the methanol that it would be carbon neutral. So in that sense, a lot of people are talking about methanol as a bridge fuel. So that it is something we're going to use now because, as the question suggests, the infrastructure to use it is more readily available. But in the future, we really want to strive to a truly carbon-free fuel, and here ammonia is likely the much better candidate.
Yep, amen. I'd really underscore that methanol is, just to repeat what you just said, not a carbon-free fuel. So when you burn carbon, you're generating ammonia. Corinne, I wanted to come to you on another question about water pollution and ammonia. And right now, ammonia runoff is a major driver of water pollution. How much of a concern do you think this is when it comes to scaling up the industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the impact that we'll see could depend on what else is going on with our environment, including climate change, unfortunately. We certainly worry about nutrient pollution. And that's the kind of more long-term impact associated with releasing reactive nitrogen into water bodies. The rule of thumb, which is very imperfect, has been that surface water bodies tend to be phosphorus limited, and marine environments, saltwater environments, tend to be nitrogen limited. And so that means, we care most about ammonia that's going to end up being deposited in these water bodies where there isn't a lot of other nitrogen there. And so if you add more nitrogen, you will get more growth of harmful algae, other microbes. And that's something we worry about. We've thought a lot about like ports as being, in some cases, the sort of at least an area where we want to really pay attention. Because from the water body perspective, you have bodies of water that are maybe nitrogen limited, and so if you have ammonia deposition there, it can stimulate more, algal blooms and stuff. And then in the air, you have the situation where you've got a lot of NOx and SOx, nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxide emission sources, and probably not a lot of other nitrogen sources unless you have agricultural production right near your ports. And so you're probably not ammonia limited there, and you might be stimulating more production of fine particulates in the air. So these are, we can kind of carve out these locations where we are especially concerned. The other thing we worry about is acute toxicity for aquatic life when you have, sort of large releases into water bodies. And so then, it depends on the pH and the temperature of the body of water that you're releasing it into. So ammonia, when it gets in water, can take an unionized form, NH3, or an ionized form, so NH4+. And the unionized form, NH3, is much more toxic to fish and more toxic to some species than others. But that means, we'll see kind of different impacts depending on the specific water body. This is why it requires a lot of monitoring to kind of understand where there might be sensitive ecosystems that we need to be extra careful about, make sure that we're not depositing. The other thing that I'll bring up is that there's a lot of ongoing research. Over the course of writing this report, it feels like every month or two there'd be another relevant paper that would come out. We're learning about the fate of ammonia, and the kind of conventional wisdom had been that it doesn't travel very far. It gets deposited pretty close to where you emit it, and that's starting to evolve. we're understanding that it can in fact travel farther than we previously thought. So that's why this is, I don't think it's a deal breaker, but it's certainly a topic that warrants a lot more R&D and monitoring.
That was a very expert and comprehensive answer. Thank you, Corinne. That's tremendous. And we're getting down to our last minutes, but I wanted to bring Fan in to talk about the use of ammonia in industry, which is something we really haven't talked about, but in this session, but something we talk about in our roadmap. And then maybe, Fan, just any context you can provide about the use of ammonia today in your home country, in China, and how that might shed any light on, or any thoughts about that, and how we can transition to low carbon ammonia in China.
Sure. Low carbon ammonia applied for heavy industry has been a research interest recently, because low carbon ammonia can just be burned to provide high quality heat. It can burn at a reasonable high temperature to provide the heat for a lot of heavy industry applications, such as it's high enough for steel production, cement production, certainly chemicals. So it could have a very big potential there. Mostly it's not really in the interest for heavy industry, majorly because these industries are really, really capital intensive. They're really not willing to take any new technology that has been tested to be commercially available and technically viable. The second thing is that for decarbonizing these heavy industries, there are potentially better options, such as direct electrification using electricity, or you can use hydrogen directly instead of ammonia, which makes the chemistry much simpler, and hydrogen can burn at an even higher temperature that we know how to handle hydrogen in these facilities, perhaps better than handling ammonia. So there's certainly reasonable amount of research opportunity and commercial applications for ammonia in China in heavy industries, but it's at a very immature stage that a lot of R&D are required, and perhaps we need to do more investigations in the next few years or in the next decade to see whether a commercial available prototype or commercial application is actually going to enter the market. It still remains unanswered questions at this moment, and we're looking forward to see more research and more results in the coming years.
Great. Well, in a minute, I want to, as we close up the session, ask each one of our speakers to just briefly make one point you think the audience should remember about low carbon ammonia. What's a really important point? But before I do that, I just want to say that just a personal reflection. Before I started working on this project, I did not fully appreciate how central ammonia is to the global economy and to modern life. One of our colleagues on the ICEF steering committee, Vaclav Smil, has written 2 books on this topic, and I highly recommend reading his books. And one of the points that Vaclav makes is that without ammonia, we could not be feeding half of the world population today. Let's repeat that the nitrogen in ammonia is used to fertilize food production today. And without that without the ability to synthesize ammonia and use it as a fertilizer, we literally could not be feeding half the population. And some of you may have studied this in school, but back at the end of the 19th century, before ammonia was first synthesized, experts were thinking that global population would be capped, or there would be mass starvation, because we were reaching the limits of agricultural productivity, and land just couldn't make more food. And it was in the first decade and 2 of the 20th century that Haber and Bosch, 2 German chemists, figured out how to synthesize ammonia. And it changed the world. And it has had enormous and far-reaching implications. And we think that another type of revolution could happen here, and that low-carbon ammonia could really make a big difference in helping to decarbonize. But there's some challenges along the way. And that's what this roadmap helps to get to. So maybe we just got 2 minutes, just brief thoughts. I'm going to turn maybe just in reverse order. I'll start with Fan, and then Corinne, and then Catherine. Just any brief point that you think the audience should take away about low carbon ammonia.
Sure, definitely. We discussed a lot of things about the challenges of producing and using ammonia, but a great point for every policymaker and everybody that ammonia is closer to us than you can ever imagine. We use that all the days, probably not in our daily life, but it's much closer to our life than you can ever imagine. So don't get scared about producing low carbon ammonia, supporting ammonia applications. Although there are a lot of challenges, they're closer to us than you can ever imagine. So publish the policies and all things to support ammonia. You will get surprised and the results will turn out to be good.
Tremendous. Corinne.
All right. I would say the environmental impacts of ammonia are I think, manageable. And we have to think of this in the context of all of the other emission sources, the other things that it can react with, but also the other sources of ammonia. And so if we want to manage those risks, we have to think not just about novel uses for ammonia, but how we could sort of manage and reduce emissions globally from all sectors.
And Catherine.
Okay, my final point is that for ammonia, it's all about implementation. To make sure we really benefit humanity and our planet, we need to be thoughtful in how we implement ammonia. Yes, there's a lot we don't know, but what we do know is that we have an existing system of natural gas and coal-based ammonia that needs carbon capture retrofits to be cleaned up. We know that we need to massively increase how much ammonia we're producing to decarbonize the fertilizer industry, making green ammonia important, and then we need options for the shipping fuel. And so I'd say climate change is urgent. We need to start with the most important uses and do it in a thoughtful way where we continue to learn as we move forward.
And my final thought is if you want to know more about this topic, download our draft ICEF roadmap. It's going to be up on the ICEF website. Please send us comments if you have any thoughts on it. The final one will be released in mid-November at COP27. Thanks to Chairman Tanaka, thanks to Nito and Mehdi for their support in all this process.
Yeah, thank you all for having us. It's a great pleasure to be here. And yeah, I'm very impressed with everything Japan is doing for ammonia as well, so thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Sandler and all the panelists. This is the end of Roadmap Project 1.